20% of Tasmanians don't have access to recycling, so that's the first problem. I mean, that's unusual. The rest of the country, about 95 or even higher percent of households have access to recycling services. And in fact, I'm aware that the leader of the opposition himself, Mr Hodgman, doesn't have access to recycling services. So we're very much looking forward to the opposition supporting our efforts on recycling. Look, there are also issues around contamination rates, which means that while we get some of the recyclate, the bottles, the cans, the papers back, some of it's unrecyclable because it's contaminated with food, or people throw silly things into the recycling bin, etc. So that's a bit of a problem.
Can I just interrupt you there and ask on that point? I'm pretty fastidious and like to think that I'm doing my bit. I rinse out my milk bottles, I rinse out my cans. I don't even put the lids in the recycling. Is that the best practice one should be doing, so that you're preventing your good gesture of being a waste of time?
Yeah, sure. All of those things are very good. What the Boomerang Alliance, however, is calling for is for the Tasmanian government to really intervene. Now, there's two particular things that the Tasmanian government can do. The first thing it could do is introduce a South Australian-style container deposit scheme, which is, as everyone would know, is the 10-cent deposit on cans and bottles, which is returned once you recycle your can or bottle. We're all familiar with it. A lot of us, did it as kids. Community groups make money out of it, etc., etc. And now that drives the highest rates of recycling possible anywhere in the world.
Is that so?
Well, South Australia gets around 80% recycling rates for bottles and cans. Tasmania's recycling of bottles and cans will be between 15 and 30%, something like that.
That's a staggering.
And it's all very clean recyclate as well. So the industry really likes it. It's sorted by colour, it's clean, it's very usable for reuse for creating more cans and bottles or whatever it might be. So that's the first intervention that's required. The second intervention, I think, is that there is inevitable that there's going to be a waste levy in Tasmania. There has to be a charge on the disposal of waste at landfills. Now, again, Tasmania is totally lagging behind. And unfortunately, the government just seems very unwilling to act on either of those fronts. Boomerang Alliance, which is an alliance of environment groups and local government from around Australia, including Australian Conservation Foundation, Clean Up Australia, Total Environment Centre and Environment Tasmania, undertook an analysis of the South Australian scheme and extrapolated the jobs and economic activity that goes on in South Australia attendant with the container deposit system, and applied those basics over to Tasmania. And so the analysis that we have is that it would generate about 300 full-time and 80 part-time jobs. And in addition, we would support, the government has a report from Hyder Consulting that says there'd be about $9 to $15 million worth of investment. And our study finds that it's about the same, that there would be between $10, $20 million worth of private sector investment coming into the state. Where does it go from here? Well, we'll be briefing politicians, and we are speaking with all three parties. And the Greens have always been very supportive of a system like this, and we're having good conversations, I think, with both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party in Tasmania.
South Australia has been a pioneer for how many years? Decades?
Yeah, South Australia's had a container deposit system for 30 years. They retained it once we moved away from refillable bottles. People will remember putting their milk bottles out and they got refilled, or even, Coke bottles, beer bottles, etc., all got refilled. Every other state dropped the deposit system, but South Australia maintained it, which is, to their credit. Now, the result of that is that South Australia have depots all over the place where you can drop bottles, cans, newspapers, but you can also get paid to drop off old computers, old car batteries, old fridges, and you get paid for that material. Now, that's totally unusual from anywhere else in Australia. The rest of the place you have to either pay to get it recycled or local government wears the cost. So we think that there's a particular case here also for local government transferring their current costs over to industry ultimately, because someone has to pay for recycling, and we would suggest it shouldn't be local government, and that industry should bear the costs for recycling of their products.
Why did you, and when I say you, I mean the Boomerang Alliance, embark on this study?
Well, I think, like so many arguments these days, the economic argument is a very important one. Our analysis is that we could generate between 300 and 380 jobs in Tasmania from adopting a container deposit system. Now, they would come in the form of the establishment of depots where people drop things off, transportation of materials from depots to recycling centres, and reprocessing and shipping of those materials. Now, that's a significant number of jobs. We're seeing job cuts across the economy. We're seeing, Tasmania needing to intervene to create, economies. And this is a great green economy that could be created. Now, 300 jobs is not insignificant. They're not highly skilled jobs.
They're statewide?
Statewide. And it would also mean that Tasmanians suddenly have access to recycling services, 95% of Tasmanians for the first time.
And if there was an establishment of depots around the state, that seems to put the onus back on the private consumer to be responsible for dropping off.
Yep.
Would you still be putting out your newspapers, whatever night
Your
of the week?
curbside facilities would still exist. Now, the advantage is that you remove the real problem items. Glass, in particular, breaks in curbside. So it contaminates the paper and the cardboard, and it also damages equipment such as Veolia's equipment, out at their MRFs. Gets into the bearings, gets into the rollers, shreds things up. It's a real problem material. You would still have curbside. You would still have paper, and you would still have other items going into curbside. You might also decide that you don't particularly care about your 10 cents per bottle, and you will dispose of that bottle in curbside. That is still available to you. You might also decide that you want to hand those, deposits over to a community group as your contribution every week.
You mentioned before that Tasmanians are among the worst in the country for recycling. What other findings in the report shocked you the most?
Well, one thing of real value in the study is that there would be significant capital investment from the private sector. So a container deposit system wouldn't cost the state government anything. The private sector comes in and invests to build infrastructure. They establish recycling depots. They put in reverse vending machines, which is a little unit where you drop your bottle into at the supermarket car park or at the council car park, and you get your receipt for your deposit back. So quite sophisticated technology can drive this. Now, that's all private sector investment. So given the fact that we've got $15 to $20 million worth of private sector investment coming in, we've got 300 odd jobs created, there's no cost to the state government. The thing that really shocks and surprises me is, why doesn't the government act? It does not make any sense. We have an environmental crisis. We've got the lowest rates of recycling. We also have litter in iconic tourist destinations, which tourists don't particularly like to see in these, wilderness experiences. It all adds up, and yet the state government is, effectively sitting on its hands and doing nothing.
And yet it wouldn't actually impact on the public purse.
No, that's right. I mean, in fact, there is a pool of unredeemed deposits. About 20% of containers don't come back for recycling. You cut it up and you make a, kid's toy out of it, or, whatever you might be doing with it. That pool of unredeemed deposits is worth about $6 million a year. Now, that can drive advertising, can offset the scheme costs. The government could employ a number of people. They could use some of those funds to better, finance the Environment Protection Authority. They could drive waste grants. They could do all sorts of things with those funds.
Rob, this issue has reared its head many times, say, over the last 30 years. So why should it be taken seriously now?
I think one of the really interesting things about a container deposit system, and as we see in South Australia, is it underpins the creation of new infrastructure for recycling. So we are now seeing that the TV and computer industry are having to establish take-back schemes and to get recycling rates for TV and computers from their current 1% to 80% by 2020. Now, they are going to need infrastructure, drop-off points for consumers to be able to recycle that material. So a container deposit system underpins the finances of those depots. So I think there's a renewed interest in waste reform, as tyres, batteries, computers, TVs are all now going to have, take-back schemes in some form placed over them. And the consumer needs somewhere to take them. So we need this infrastructure. I think the other really important thing is that the beverage companies have been the traditional opponents. And people usually ask me, well, why? They're basically afraid that as a consumer, if you are required to pay 10 cents more, even if it's a deposit, you're going to buy less of their products. Less Cascade beer, less Coca-Cola, less, whatever it might be. We think that's complete rubbish. But the beverage companies, Coke, Lion Nathan and Foster's, are extremely powerful lobby organisations and have effectively run the agenda around recycling and waste. And I think that's starting to change. And I think there's a lot of other parties who've been tied up with that story who have shifted away. And those guys are now sort of isolated. But look, they have been very powerful for a very long time. They spend millions of dollars on lobbying. And, I guess the environment sector doesn't have those kinds of resources. So that's a significant shift that is occurring and giving... Both of those things, I think, are giving weight to this. And the community is demanding action on sustainability. The community don't want 14% recycling rates. They're very supportive of, taking action and doing their bit. And recycling is such a good example of doing your bit for the environment.
Tasmania has also recently, sadly, emerged as having the most litter per square kilometre, and you mentioned just then litter in national parks. How would this sort of program have an impact on those figures?
Well, look, as Ian Kiernan from Clean Up Australia points out every year, they go, Clean Up Australia and the 500,000 odd Australians who go out every year on Clean Up Australia Day to pick up stuff, go back to the same sites and every year pick up cans and bottles again and again and again. I mean, I was down at the waterfront at the harbour earlier this year on Clean Up Australia Day. And, those guys were pulling out all sorts of strange things like bicycles. But they were literally pulling out hundreds of beer bottles from the bottom of the harbour down in Hobart. It was really disgusting to see. And, there won't be a kid, whoever, drinking a beer bottle on, down there at the docks who'll throw it in when it's worth 10 cents to them. That will totally change the economics of that. And you drive through South Australia and you go through the streets, you simply do not see a bottle and can lying on the ground.